Then in regard to the adept tradition of siddhas, we have the lay persons Marpa and Milarepa around the same time as Atisha. And they founded something called the Kagyu order. They were from rich peasant families and merchant families. And they had an ambition, however, not just to do business, but to adopt the highly respected profession called Lodzawa, translator, or literally eye of the nation, seeking to explore the enlightenment-oriented higher culture of India in order to find a greater knowledge and better life for his fellow Tibetans. In our modern culture, since we think we have the most advanced culture on earth that ever occurred, a translator has a rather more lowly role because they're just looking at what weird things some other people did in the lesser cultures around them. But in this case, in Tibet, looking into India, they had the idea that it was a more advanced culture than their own. They had a humility like that. So they really honored the Lodzawa, or the translation. In fact, it translates Lodzawa as public eye, like a private eye, investigating on the behalf of the people some higher way of learning and science and living and ethics for the people, and that's what the Lodzawas were in the Tibetan history. Now, Marpa journeyed across the Himalayas to find his many teachers, especially his root teacher called Naropa, who had retired from being the head scholar of Nalanda University and had become a great adept after many studies under the adept Tilopa. Actually, Naropa's story is kind of fun to tell, where Naropa was sitting in the university president's office reading a text, and the cleaning lady came in and she said to him, "Well, sonny boy, do you know what you're reading there?" And he said, "Yeah, I know, I can read it." "Yeah, you can read the words, that's nice," she said, as she's sweeping there. And then she said, "Do you know the meaning?" And then he said, "Yeah, I know the meaning." And then she started crying. And then he said, "Why are you crying? Like, just stop crying, you're disturbing my studies." She said, "Oh, I'm crying because even the president of the university can tell a lie," she said. He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you say you understand the meaning, but you don't really understand it," she said. So then he realized that was true, he was honest, and he said, "Well, who does understand it really then, the way you mean?" And she said, "Oh, my brother does." And she said, "Where is he?" "Oh, he lives in the jungle about 40 miles from here." He said, "Oh, can I go see him?" She says, "No, probably you can't. You won't be able to find him. But anyway, you might try," she said. "And then you should say such and such a mantra 1,000 times if you want on the way." And then she turned into rainbow light and disappeared out the window. So then he threw off his tweed jacket, university president, and he ran off into the woods in a loincloth and eventually became a great adept, Naropa, who had been the head professor of the university. I think a great story for academics, really nice story. So the teachings which Marpa brought back with him from his study and practice journeys in India were essentially the same as those brought by Atisha, but the monastic practice and path of renunciation and transcendence, the messianic practices of the transcendent wisdom of emptiness and the cultivation of love, compassion, and universal responsibility, coupled with the swift engagement in the contemplative evolutionary practices of the unexcelled yoga tantras. Like this couple here, The memorial next to me. The immortal Milarepa was the most important disciple of Marpa, having been born in another wealthy commoner peasant family, but he was disinherited by a wicked uncle, sort of a little bit of a Hamlet story, upon the death of the father Milarepa. But then he made a name for himself as a black magic sorcerer. Instead of like Hamlet with swords, he did sorcery against the uncle, and he killed 35 people. But then he became racked with guilt over having caused the deaths of so many people with this sorcery. So he sought the transformative teachings of the white magic of the Dharma at the feet of Marpa the translator. Marpa then forced him to go through terrible ordeals in a really immortal biographical story in order to cleanse his heavy evolutionary burden from having killed the people. After bringing him near the point of suicide, frustrating him so badly, Marpa did, by putting him through ordeals, that Marpa finally introduced him to the bodhisattva path of wisdom and compassion and initiated him in the yogic tantric mandala Buddha verses of Hevajra Buddha and Chakrasambhara Super Bliss Buddha, urging him to spend the rest of his life in contemplative retreat. This Milarepa did, learning to live in the high Himalayan winter with merely a cotton robe, while practicing the 5 advanced yogas of magic body, inner fury fire, which is how he kept warm, lucid dream yoga, death, soul ejection, and clear light immersion. And you have to learn the meaning of these, even the names of these yogas sound strange. I'm sure you can learn them from the supporting materials in the course. Within 12, you learn them, what they are. To learn them to practice, then you have to be an astronaut, psychonaut, you know. Within 12 years, Milarepa is believed to have become a perfectly enlightened adept and subsequently traveled all over Tibet and taught thousands of people. It turned out that he had been, from youth, an accomplished singer. I used to jokingly say, like the Bob Dylan of Tibet. And so he taught his disciples his teachings, very profound ones, but in a folk song sort of format, making them very memorable and popular so that Tibetans can memorize them even if they're not practicing them. And they've been sung by Tibetans endlessly for centuries ever since. When he revered his mentor Marpa as the quintessence of all Buddhas, Milarepa himself became widely recognized by members of all orders as the first Tibetan to become a perfect Buddha within a single lifetime. Started out as an ordinary man, even a murderer, and yet his single-minded practice of the unexcelled Yoga Tantras led him to the evolutionary culmination of Buddhahood in a single lifetime, according to the belief of Tibetans. He thus became the example for generations of Tibetans who sought their own most high destinies following his example. I must say, my first book that I read about Tibetan Buddhism, from the original book, was his life story, which was recommended to me by Henry Miller, of all people, as like the St. Francis of Asia, you know, equivalent, even I think in historical time, to St. Francis of Assisi, and sort of an Asian Buddhist version of that. The social model of an aristocratic lineage associating itself with a charismatic center of study and attainment became widely popular among all the Buddhist orders during this period. Flourished in Tibet from that time. The Kön family founded the monastery and order of Sakya in 1073. The inspiration for their movement did not come from the political arena, but from the spiritual. The Indian Buddhist monk and Tantric Adept Virupa, having mastered his monastic studies, perfecting the self-control, extending his messianic commitment, and gaining deep insight into the selflessness and voidness, entered the tantric acceleration of physical and spiritual evolution toward Buddhahood. With the blessings of the wisdom goddess archetype Vajra Nairatmya, literally meaning diamond selflessness, the female Buddha, he attained total Buddhahood on the subtle body-mind level, choosing to remain in the coarse world in his former gross body as a great adept. A great story about Virupa is, you see many images of Virupa. We'll have one in the materials where he holds up one finger like this, and he's sort of fat and corpulent, and he's drinking. And the famous story was he went to a bar in some town and demanded beer and just drank endless amounts of beer, and he said he would pay his bill at sundown. And then he kept drinking and demanding, and he didn't want to pay, so he held up a finger and he stopped the course of the sun so it wouldn't go down. Then everybody was freaking out because nightfall was not coming, so finally the king had to come and pay the bill so that he would let the sun go down. It's just a legend, but it's the way that the great adepts are considered, you know, in the magical kind of enchanted type of culture. Then in the 13th century, the Mongolian warlord Godan Khan summoned the Sakya Pandita Kunga Gyaltsen to represent Tibet within the Mongol Empire, and to see if he would avoid having to invade Tibet, to include it in his empire, in other words. His successor, Sakya Pandita's successor, his nephew Pagpa, also became very important advisor to the Mongol kings, and later became the central advisor and preceptor of Kublai Khan, who really grounded the Mongol Empire in China, finally moving from Karakoram into Beijing area, and thus beginning the Tibetan. But the fact of Pagpa being his advisor, and then Kublai Khan giving Tibet, so to speak, to be administered by Pagpa, this began the Tibetan innovation within Buddhism of a monastic serving as sovereign of the whole nation, taking responsibility, that is, for people's social as well as spiritual welfare. During this time, Tibet was divided into 13 provinces, almost all of them ruled by a noble family associated with an important monastic center of one order or another, the main ones being Kadampa, Sakyapa, Kagyupa, and Nyingmapa. Among the 12 Kagyupa orders developing from Gampopa's foundation, the Karma Kagyu was an important one due to a particular institutional innovation they developed, the institutionalization of official reincarnations. A number of great teachers, of course, in the past, in Buddhist history, had attained memory of their former lives, and there were stories of a teacher being reborn in specific circumstances and accomplishing further good works in the same sort of social setting, and being thought of as the reincarnation of a predecessor, sort of in general. But no, in none of these societies did that become an institution. Whereas in the case of the second Karmapa, he was just a little boy born 10, 11 years after his former incarnation had passed away in 1204, but as a child remembering events of the previous life and demanding from his parents and uncles and aunts and neighbors, I want to go back to my monastery and keep teaching my disciples. After first thinking he was just insane, they started to discuss that with him, and they actually then took him back there. Then he recognized all the people by name, and he knew about all his own objects that he had owned, etc. So they accepted that he was reincarnated. And then again, when he died, a third child was recognized as reincarnation, etc. And this very important tradition of formal reincarnation was begun. And this institution had a profound effect on the Tibetan civilization. And why? Because in spiritual terms, the reincarnation proved to the people the efficacy of the most advanced apocalyptic tantric yogas, that it was indeed possible for a human being to become a Buddha in a single lifetime, and thereby have the ability to have lucid dying, and to die lucidly and take rebirth lucidly, and go and find a mother and a family in a neighborhood where they had lived before in order to go back to their monastery and keep teaching, etc. And so to provide a kind of leadership that didn't require a birth dynasty like the usual Oriental way of dynastic leadership transmission, and to really have monastic leadership transmission by the reincarnation of the leader. And so this was remarkable. I must confess, as a younger scholar, I thought it was kind of a corruption. I was a little against it, even though Dalai Lama was a friend of mine. Even when I was a monk with him, I told him, Your Holiness, you should abandon having to worry about the politics of Tibet. Just be a monk and become a big guru. And be like Shakyamuni, like say, I don't want to bother with the social situation. And he said nothing he would like better as a Buddhist monk, but he couldn't do it because people depended on him to try to speak up for them, and they would be depressed if he did that. So I didn't understand it. But then later I understood the reincarnation institution as necessary in the process of demilitarizing the country. Because the royal layman dynastic ruler, like the emperor of one of those countries, they're always going to have an army. And so they will not give up their troops, Whereas the monastic leader, his troops are monks who don't fight, or they're supposed not to fight. Now and then they do, but they're not supposed to. So it's a way of totally pacifying and mainstreaming, if you will, the Buddhist principles in the social system, is the reincarnation tradition I finally discovered by studying it sociologically. Anyway, so thus Tibetan Buddhists no longer needed to think of the supreme examples of the Buddhist education and evolution as only having existed in an ancient historic past in the Holy Land of India. Real Buddhas, living, breathing, teaching, helping, blessing, could be found among them right there in Tibet. In fact, it became such a strong thing that you couldn't even run for local sheriff in Tibet in the last century or two without saying, well, I'm a reincarnation, that's the reason. I have long time in practice in office because I already held this office in my previous life. So it became like that. Thus, there seemed to the people to be no deficiency in the tradition, no obstacle for any Tibetan to go as far as his or her practice as intelligent and effort would carry. On the social level, this institution created a way of leadership succession in celibate monastic communities, which made it unnecessary to maintain a special relationship with a particular noble family, as in the case of the Sakya order or the Pagmodru Kagyu order. This then prepared the way for the eventual emergence of monastic governance, an institution that occurred only in Tibet and nowhere else in the Buddhist world.